Today, you're going to learn how to time a pre-delay. Pre-delays, often seen in reverbs, are a great tool. And while you can just turn that pre-delay up to accomplish your task, this doesn't always sound the best. While there's always a little bit of a pre-delay to your reverb, depending on the amount of time it takes for sound to travel to whatever wall your room size is and back to your ear, adding some pre-delay isn't very natural or realistic. As soon as we start changing the pre-delay, we start moving into a world of fakery. And if we're going to fake the funk, we might as well make it musical so it sounds like it belongs. So let's get started. Please smash that like button and subscribe. So to calculate this, we are actually going to divide 60,000 by our BPM. And before we get any farther, I'm going to explain why so that you can actually remember this and make sense of it. BPM is beats per minute. So we're at 1 minute off tops. 1 minute is 60 seconds. And here's the part for some people, like for me, that was hard to remember. Our delay is in milliseconds. And 1 millisecond is 1,000th of a second. For some of us, that's kind of messed up. Because without the context that a milli is 1,000, you would hear milli and think millionth. You would think a millisecond was a millionth of a second. But the root word milli in millionth actually means 1,000. So a million is 1,000 thousand. And that wasn't a stutter. 1 million, is 1,000 thousands. Now, with that little bit of context and understanding, hopefully we can remember that a millisecond is 1,000th of a second. With that being said, if we have 60 seconds in a minute, and we multiply that by the fact we have 1,000 milliseconds in a second, we see we have 60,000 milliseconds in 1 minute. And you may ask, well, why do I care? And I may answer, well, I will answer why. You see, in our project, we have beats per minute. Every time you bob your head, that is generally considered a beat. You may have heard of upbeats, downbeats, the one beat, beat. Well, if our project is defined by a certain amount of those beats per minute, then we can find out when one beat happens by doing some division. So if I change our BPM here to 120, just to make this easier math, you'll see this comes out to a whole number, and I divide our 1 minute by the 120 beats that happens within that minute, 1,000 divided by 120, we get 500 milliseconds for every single beat. One beat every 500 milliseconds in that minute. Now, most of the time, this one beat that's happening every 500 milliseconds is going to be a quarter note. The only time this isn't true is when the number at the bottom of our time signature is not a 4. Now, if you don't know what I just said, that's okay. We can just assume that it's a quarter. And if you want to learn about time signatures and beats, click the video above. However, regardless of if it's a quarter note or an eighth note or whatever, by doing this math, we're still always going to be on time. So I just set up a reverb with a 500 millisecond delay on this closed hi-hat. If I were to play my metronome, which is going to play on every single beat, we'll notice, because it's equal to one beat, that pre-delay is going to make it so we have our hi-hat play, and then our reverb's going to happen on the next beat or the next quarter note. So if we listen, see, 1 reverb, 3, 4. 1 reverb, 3, 4. Now, while this is a really cool effect, this is not quite practical for normal use. Usually we want to move a reverb just far enough out of the way that it doesn't wash out our source signal, but it's still as close to realistic as possible. But the cool thing is that 500 milliseconds, we're now on time. So now we just divide in half over and over again until we get a time that we like. This is already a quarter note, so if I were to cut it in half, it'd become an eighth. If I cut it in half again, it'd become a 16th. If I cut it in half again, it'd become a 32nd, and one more time, it'd become a 64th. Now, we could just divide by 4, and this would give us a 16th. However, to keep the math simple, we'll just divide by half twice. So now we have 125 milliseconds for our 16th note. If I change this in the reverb, and we listen, it's on time. And that sounds pretty good, but it's still pushing it when it comes to realism. There's still quite a gap between when the sound gets to us versus the initial source sound. What we can do is we can divide by 2, and I'd recommend dividing by 2 again. What you're going to notice, though, is now we have a fraction. So do you round a fraction? Do you not round a fraction? What do you do? What I suggest is you always round your fraction up. Usually when rounding 31.25, you would just round it to 31. It's the closest. You haven't hit 5 or past 5. That's how you would generally do it. But for us, we're going to do this above. And you can think of it like giving swing to your sound. You're pushing it off just a little bit, giving it a little bit of swing while still keeping it on beat. People call this the pocket, and I don't know the exact physics or 100% the reasons why, but it's something that, regardless if it's a big deal or not, why not just push it up? It's just as easy to go to 32 as it is to go to 31. So now if we go to 32, now you'll see this sounds more like one sound. If I turn off our metronome, booyah. And this is going to be a 64th note for our delay. If you want to get to a 64th, and that's what you want to use by default, you can divide by 4 twice. If I go 500 here, you'll see if I divide by 4, we get the same number that we had a second ago. However, when in doubt, just divide by 2, you'll end up getting there. Now, understand that there's already pre-delay built into your room and the time it takes for early reflections to get to you. This is something that's already going to be programmed into the algorithms of most of these reverbs, from what I understand. So what you're really doing by going so low with your pre-delay is you're trying to move the sound out of the way, but have it close enough that your ears and your brain aren't quite perceiving it as so drastic or so unrealistic. And by keeping it musical, we help give it that feel that it belongs there, even though it isn't necessarily natural or realistic. You're really trying to get your brain to not register as obvious of a difference between what the reality of the room that you're trying to create your sound in by using a reverb actually is, versus the physics-defying travel time that you are creating before you're hearing this room. Now, this travel time, although not necessarily realistic, causes whatever you're adding your reverb to hit you first and way sooner than the room that it's reverberating in is going to hit you. Thus, the longer the travel time, the farther away it is, and therefore, the more depth you're actually creating, which, if you ask me, is pretty cool. So a pre-delay is something that can move our reverb out of the way of our sound. However, since it bends realism, we make it musical so that it fits better in that aspect. The more of this pre-delay we have, the farther back or farther away a room's going to sound from our source sound, which is going to add some depth. And with having this understanding and knowing the math, we can decide how quickly or how far away we want that pre-delay to happen. If you like this video, please like this video. If you have any comments, please comment. I always appreciate a subscribe. It's Warren with Scale Audio, and adios.